Okay, so today what we're going to talk about, so we're done with program design, unfortunately. So hopefully you know how to at least, well, we'll find out in your assignment, but at least create a program that someone can start off with. So now we're going to shift kind of our focus into more of those adaptations that happen when we are doing aerobic or resistance training. What's actually happening physiologically? Well, why do you need to know this? Well, that's going to enhance your understanding of why you're programming what you are and educating both yourself and your clients of what's actually changing in their body when they, do this type of training. So hopefully you'll find some of these interesting. Maybe you know some of these already based on what you've maybe learned in exercise physiology. If you learned a little bit about adaptations, and feel free again, ask questions that you might have at any time. So we'll be going through the responses and adaptations to both resistance and aerobic training today, okay? So first we need to understand the definitions of acute versus chronic adaptation. So what's an acute response? It's more like a response. And then what's a chronic adaptation? So an acute response is that short-term change that's going to happen immediately after your training session. And so whatever short-term changes that happen, this will then lead to those chronic adaptations and drive those chronic adaptations. Okay, so it's a short-term change. It will, go back to, your normal levels after, but right after you're done your session, what actually happens? And then on the other hand, chronic adaptations, this is changes that occur after a long period of time. And this is repeated training bouts. And this will last long after your session is over. So this is, again, your long-term adaptations that happen. So understanding that you can't just train, two times and expect all these adaptations to happen. It does take time. It does take a period of time. So you could see, some adaptations happening in as quick as 4 to 6 weeks, maybe some people longer, 8 weeks. It's hard to give you a timeline of exactly how long until you see these adaptations. It really depends on, your frequency, how intense are you going, and then your training history, and, everyone adapts a little differently to the training. But understanding the difference between acute and chronic adaptations, okay? So we're going to start off talking about resistance training adaptations first, and then we'll later talk about aerobic training adaptations. So there's so many benefits of resistance training. And I feel like resistance training, that's the one a lot of people are like, nah, that's okay. I like to go run, or I like to do my cardio. And it's easier to just hop on an elliptical for 30 minutes and go for it and leave than, do some resistance exercises. And this is so important, especially as we get older. And I'm going to skip all the way to the last point, which is sarcopenia. And if anyone remembers what that means, sarcopenia is age-related muscle loss. So as we get older, we do lose muscle, right? You're not going to look the same as you did, when you're 20 versus when you're 80, right? That doesn't mean you're going to have no muscle, but you will lose some muscle mass as you age. But resistance training will help attenuate the loss so you don't lose as much, right? And that's so important as we get older. If you would like to be in a wheelchair or like to use a walker or cane, then okay, go ahead, don't do resistance training. But if you want to try and avoid, having mobility issues and not being able to move as freely, then resistance training is definitely going to be beneficial. As well, osteoporosis, we know that's bone mineral loss. And so the bone density goes down as we get older, right? If we aren't doing resistance training and have weight bearing on our bones. And again, resistance training will help with that, right? So, cardio is not really going to help with the sarcopenia. It's good, you need it for your heart, but the cardio training is not going to help maintain your muscle mass the same way as resistance training does. And so we can see all these other benefits, right? We're going to be stronger, have more power, more balance and coordination. Also important as we age, right? So we reduce the risk of falls. Even our basal metabolic rate increases, and that means we can burn more calories at rest if you have more muscle mass. We'll have more lean tissue, which is more muscle. We're going to have stronger ligaments and tendons. Our muscular endurance increases. Our motor performance even increases. Also helps with insulin sensitivity. So resistance training can actually help with managing diabetes. I'm not going to go into detail of that. I hope you probably have learned that in another class. And it can decrease body fat percent and also decrease incidence of low back pain. So again, if you want to reduce your risk of having pains and ailments as you get older, definitely resistance training will help with that. So again, just looking at all these benefits, when I see that, I'm like, of course I want to do resistance training so I can prevent all these things to happen as I get older. And I hope, that helps to motivate some of you, and maybe that will help motivate some of your clients, right? Because a lot of people kind of shy away from resistance training. You don't have to go super crazy heavy weights. You don't have to be a power lifter, right? As long as you are putting those muscles under some stress and load, they will adapt and you will be stronger. And that's what we want. And you're not going to end up looking like this girl. If you're a female and you train, she's definitely taking stuff. But that doesn't mean you're going to look like that if you do resistance training. And that's, again, a big misconception, especially with females, that, oh, if I do resistance training, I'm going to look like a man. No, you will not. Okay. It takes a lot of hard work to look like that. And also some help with some, performance enhancing things.
I just have a
So,
question.
yeah, sure.
So with the sarcopenia, like how would that differ, like if you're looking at like an athlete or like a super advanced, like let's say like a pro athlete, or like even somebody just like in a competitive sport opposed to like the general population? Like would like a pro athlete or somebody who's trained like almost their entire life, would they have a lesser chance of developing it more severely than like the general population as like somebody who's never worked out before?
Yeah, for sure. So again, as long as you're maintaining what you're doing as you're getting older as well, it's not like, oh, hey, in my 20s, I was competitive and then I stopped, right? So continuing that, for sure, you're not going to see as much of a muscle loss, and you're going to be so much stronger when you're, let's say, in your 60s compared to that person who never did anything, right? And you probably will not have as much pain and ailments. And again, you won't have as much of a decrease in muscle. And so this usually starts happening at around 40. We start seeing decreases in muscle mass as we get older. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. Okay, so there's a video here. If we have time at the end, we can play it, but I would really recommend watching it. It is 12 minutes, but it's posted for you on DC Connect. I would watch it. If you are interested in hypertrophy and building muscle, it's a really good video, but I'll do a quick summary in the next slide of some important points from the video. So this, maybe you didn't learn before, is about the mechanisms of what stimulates hypertrophy, right? Okay, yeah, doing weights, that'll stimulate hypertrophy, but what are some mechanisms of how we can stimulate? There's not just one mechanism, there's actually several. So the first one is mechanical tension. And so basically, by working through full range of motion with an exercise and having tension on that muscle through the exercise, that will stimulate muscle growth. Okay. Again, going through full ranges of motion and having appropriate tension. And I think we would know that already. Okay. And especially we know that those eccentric contractions and that tension in the eccentric contractions is what will help stimulate that muscle growth. So really focusing, on that eccentric contraction in anything you're doing. You could, work with tempo, but again, depending on the exercises that you do, some exercises actually work a lot more in the eccentric phase. And so an example of that could be a stiff leg deadlift. So that's a lot of eccentric load on the hamstrings, and that tension in the hamstrings that is created in that eccentric contraction, you will be sore the next day doing any eccentric loading on the hamstrings. So if you do hamstring curls, great, but you will be more sore if you did like a stiff leg deadlift or a good morning. And a good morning is like when you have a bar or a weight on your back and then you're doing the same movement as a deadlift, because we're eccentrically loading the hamstring. And so that's creating mechanical tension, and it will lead to what the next point is muscle damage, right? So when we're putting a muscle under load in an eccentric contraction, we will create micro tears, and that's the muscle damage. And the muscle damage is a good thing. Okay, you don't have to be sore after every workout. Okay, but if you are sore, that indicates you've created muscle damage, and the muscle will repair stronger, and it will hopefully get bigger as you adapt to your training. So the muscle damage is actually something that stimulates hypertrophy as well. So if you're never sore after any resistance training you do, it's probably an indication it's not hard enough. Now, again, I'm not saying every session should make you sore. You can't walk up the stairs, you can't lift anything, you can't, blow dry your hair or something. You might be doing too much, right? But if you are doing, let's say, 2 days a week, I'm going hard, one for upper, one for lower body, let's say, and you're sore after that, that will help with hypertrophy. Okay. But as I said, it doesn't have to be every session. And then the last example, okay, so metabolic stress. So this is when you feel the burn, okay, or you get a pump after your training. And I'm sure some of you have experienced that, right? You get a pump after. By getting all that blood flow to that muscle and basically putting it to near failure, but in more of that, ow, it burns, rather than I physically cannot, it's too heavy, that will also stimulate hypertrophy. So the two main ways is you can have the tension on the muscle, okay, by doing an exercise with appropriate weight, like a heavier weight, that will basically challenge that muscle. And again, this is like that 6 to 12 rep range for hypertrophy. Or you can pump out high reps, and that's kind of what I was explaining with the band, by doing, like, let's say 50 reps of band pull aparts at the end until you feel the burn and you can't do anymore. And when you have like a light band and it feels heavy by the end, and you're getting that pump after, that metabolic stress will also stimulate hypertrophy. So in conclusion, like in training, I would use a combination of both. So you can do, some exercises where you have enough of that stress and load on that muscle that you're trying to target in whatever exercise you're doing. And then that's one option. And then you can also do some burnouts, right? And that's where like drop sets, pyramid sets, or just doing anything just to like max out and burn the muscle, and you'll feel the burning. That will stimulate hypertrophy as well. Okay. And so understanding, as you get more advanced, it will be harder to just get bigger and bigger and bigger, right? So thinking that genetics play a role, which we'll talk about, but nutrition, right? Are you eating enough to help build muscle? Sleep, are you sleeping enough? Are you hydrated? And so thinking of other factors too that can influence how well you respond, right? For people who are doing like, elite bodybuilding and competing, like this is all they do. They train like all day and they sleep, eat, train, right? But most of us, work, have a life, right? So training is just kind of part of that. So you're probably not going to get to the same level of these people who this is their life and that's all they do. So maybe that's a new thing you've learned, hopefully, maybe, and feel free to say yes or no in the chat, or you knew that already, but you can use a combination of both methods to maximize your hypertrophy. And so the video that is in the slide before, it does explain it in more detail, and I do recommend watching it, okay? So we're going to talk about some acute responses and then chronic responses to resistance training. And so we know acute is what happens right away. And I'm just going to highlight some important ones. You don't need to know like everything in the chart. And this is straight from your textbook of just some cool things that happen. So let's talk about neurological responses. So EMG is basically like that muscle contraction. So basically we're going to have more muscle activation. And let's review what a motor unit is, because that's going to come back several times today. So remember what a motor unit is. That is the motor neuron, the nerve, and all the muscle fibers that it innervates. Okay. And so if we can recruit more motor units, which that means we can then recruit more muscle, right? And so that means an acute response to training is we're going to get more muscle activated, right? So that's kind of like your summary of your neurological responses. And we'll talk about, what happens is that chronic adaptation, okay? Some muscular changes that happen. So thinking back, you got to go back physiology a little bit here. Hydrogen ion increases, okay, because that is a byproduct of lactic acid production. We get even phosphate increase. Think of ATP-CP system, right? And so if we go CP, creatine phosphate concentration, it decreases, okay, because we're using it. So when we do resistance training, we will be using our ATP-CP system, okay? And, not heavily into our aerobic system really are we working when we're doing resistance training, depending what type of resistance training you're doing. If you're doing like high reps, low weight, you'll be more aerobic, but we'll talk about most of it is anaerobic. So you'll also be using glycogen as your fuel for resistance training, and you'll see that goes down after training. Now, one thing you might think and ask is, what about creatine supplementation, right? And you probably have learned this already. But creatine, yes, it has been shown to help with performance with resistance training. It's not going to help you run a marathon. And the creatine will help you with that less than 10 seconds. So if you're going for a 1 rep max or like really heavy weight, for lower reps, it will help. Okay. There are people who are non-responders, that has existed in studies. But a lot of people, if you go on a loading phase of creatine, it will work. It's not illegal. There's not really many negative consequences to taking it. It may upset your stomach if you take too much. But again, it's not something that I would say, oh, don't take it, it's bad for you. So that, again, understanding it and how it works, right? It's basically maximizing your creatine phosphate stores so we don't decrease as fast. And so we have kind of more to use. So maybe you knew that already. Hopefully you've learned that. And then we can see some endocrine changes. When we talk about endocrine, that's our hormones. And so we can see all our hormones pretty much increase acutely after. So epinephrine, we know that's part of our fight or flight response. That's going to increase our heart rate, right? Cortisol, also part of that fight or flight response. And, resistance training is a stress on the body, right? But it's a good stress, right? Because then we get some beneficial adaptations from it. Testosterone increases, growth hormone increases, and those are going to help to further stimulate muscle growth after. And we'll go through that again as part of your chronic adaptations. Okay. So let's talk about some chronic adaptations here to resistance training. And I'm sure you know most of these already, hopefully. So muscle performance, obviously we're going to get stronger. We're going to be more powerful. Even our endurance goes up, right? Well, what endurance? I'm not doing aerobic training. However, if you're doing, let's say 3 sets of whatever, 10 to 12, and you're doing 6 to 8 exercises and you're going with not like too long of rest in between, and you're doing that for an hour, that's still working on endurance, right? Can you endure that hour session? Some people can't, right? And so it's not going to be to the same extent as if you were running, but you will improve your endurance, okay? Muscle enzymes. So again, we see that our enzyme levels of like phosphagen, so ATP-CP system, we have a little bit more to help as we adapt, okay? And even glycolytic enzymes to help break down glycogen so we can mobilize the glucose and use it for energy when we're training. We can see it increases, okay? ATP concentration may increase, not much to show that, but we're looking at like absolute levels versus a concentration. We can see like the absolute levels of creatine go up, absolute levels of ATP go up. An important one too is lactate. And so we know lactate is produced anaerobically. A lot of resistance training is anaerobic if you, again, are doing those lower reps and higher weight. And so we know that as we get more fit and more trained, that lactate won't go up as much during exercise because, again, it's not as much of a stress on our body. We have some more enzymes and, kind of everything works more efficiently. So lactate won't go up as much. And so you'll have to work harder to get to that burn versus, you had a lighter weight and you felt the burn quicker. So the lactate increase is less. We don't have as much of a lactate increase during exercise, okay? Also, fiber type changes. So what happens with resistance training to fiber type changes? So let's review our fiber types. Remember, we have the 3 main fiber types. Hopefully you remember. I'll type them here for you. Type 1, type 2A, and type 2X, right? Maybe ringing some bells now, right? So we know type 1 are those oxidative fibers, right? So more aerobic. And then your type 2X are on the other end of the spectrum, they're anaerobic, okay? And they're primarily like ATP-CP, anaerobic, and not using oxygen, right? Now, for resistance training, well, type 1, that's more aerobic, okay? That's gonna help with endurance. And type 2X is not a good thing because they fatigue really easily, okay? So we actually want type 2A. That's like nice. It's a hybrid between both, right? So not as aerobic, and then they don't fatigue as easily. And so what adaptation actually happens is we will convert type 2X to type 2A, okay? And that happens as a chronic adaptation to resistance training. And so you'll see in the chart, we see percent type 2A increase, okay? And we also know that hypertrophy happens. So the cross-sectional area, CSA, if you see that in the chart under muscle fiber characteristics, we see an increase in cross-sectional area. So, and we'll talk about that, which means that the muscle fiber gets bigger, and that is hypertrophy. That is what happens. And again, understanding that this is happening with the type 2 fibers with training, resistance training, okay? So resistance training acts on those type 2 fibers, and we can actually convert type 2X to type 2A. Type 1 fibers, not much change. Okay, that's more that adaptation to aerobic training, which we'll talk about later. Okay, so just understanding, and hopefully you remember that. And if you have questions or need me to repeat it anytime, please let me know. Looking at body composition, we see an increase in fat-free mass, increased muscle mass. We know that happens with resistance training. Maybe a likely decrease in percent fat. What's your diet like, right? And metabolic rate likely increases, which is that resting metabolic rate. Then neurological changes, we're going to talk about that in a bit as well, but we can see our motor units can fire faster, okay? And we get more recruitment of our motor units, and I'll talk about that in more detail in a second, okay? And then some structural changes, well, most likely we're going to improve our bone mineral density. It will help, okay? And connective tissue, such as our ligaments and tendons, are stronger, okay? So lots of awesome adaptations that happen. And I hope, and again, maybe you know these already, but I hope you kind of appreciate more kind of what happens as part of resistance training. So we're going to now go through each one in a little more detail, and I'll kind of highlight the main ones as we just talked about in the chart. So we have neurological adaptations, muscular adaptations, and endocrine. And then remember, endocrine is hormonal adaptation. So we're going to highlight some important adaptations here to resistance training. So I think I showed you this chart many weeks ago, okay? And this is a really important chart to understand, okay, of what happens when we start resistance training. So we can see the green line here, okay? So let's say someone was a couch potato tanning all day, every day. I wish. Probably not on a lawn chair, probably on a couch. So we can see strength increases happen really quickly early on, okay, for someone who just starts resistance training. And we see quite a sharp increase. So let's see what you remember. What is driving this increase in strength early on? Is it those neural adaptations or hypertrophy? What's driving the improvements in strength early on? Awesome, thank you, David. Yeah, it's the neural adaptation, okay? So that's that purple line we see here, and that's, you know, pretty steep as well, a pretty steep line, and similar to the strength improvements, right? And so those happen early on, and we'll talk about what's actually happening now, what neural adaptations are happening, and then eventually it plateaus. So we kind of maximize our ability to recruit all our muscles and those neurological adaptations. Then later on, takes longer, okay, so these adaptations take a little longer to happen. It's hypertrophy, that's your pink or red line here. And that will then drive the increases in strength. So your muscles will get bigger. You're not going to get huge and massive. You need to really work on that. And yes, males, it's easier to get bigger than it is for females. But yes, you will have increase in diameter of your muscle fibers, and that's hypertrophy. And that happens, again, it takes longer, but we also eventually plateau. So both of them plateau at some point, and then eventually kind of your strength plateaus. And then it's going to be a lot harder to make adaptations. This can take years, okay? It's not like, oh, I trained for 6 months and that's it, I plateau. Then you need to start looking at your programming, okay? And so, you know, is your frequency appropriate, intensity, all that stuff, and playing around with your program. And so that's where program design, looking at periodization over long term, is very important, because again, are we challenging ourselves to make more improvements, right? Or is it like the same thing over and over? So that's, again, more next semester. So then eventually, again, as you get really advanced, you plateau, and then that's where, when you get to that elite level and you're like in high performance level, where people do resort to performance enhancing drugs to get to that next level, right? Where it's literally like a pounds, you know, difference between people, let's say powerlifting, right? To be that champion, it's like a few pounds, right? Or, you know, a sprinter, right? It's milliseconds. So, and it's not always steroids. It could be, you know, some different performance enhancing drugs, but understanding that people do resort to that, because you will, once you're at that high level, plateau, okay? So understanding, again, the summary of this chart here is that early on, when someone starts training, the main driver for adaptation and improvements in strength is those neural adaptations. Then later on, it's hypertrophy. And that is what you need to know from this, okay? And so let's talk about what are those neural adaptations, what's happening, and we'll get there in one sec. But usually about like 8 to 10 weeks, we're gonna see a huge increase in strength. And so we're gonna see this orange line here. We're gonna see again that this is those neural adaptations, huge increase. But then after that, we kind of level off, right? And again, it could be a little longer for some people, depending on, you know, how they're training, but then eventually kind of plateau, right? Because we've kind of maximized our neural adaptations, and then the increase in muscle size later, which is the purple line, is what's going to be driving your increases in strength. And so we kind of, our performance might go down a little bit and then goes up again. Okay. So understanding that, you know, training over long term, it's going to kind of look like this. We're going to go in weight peaks and waves, right? You're going to be really strong, and then some days or weeks you might not be as strong, and then go back up. And that's kind of how it's going to go, right? You're not just going to be a linear line and get stronger, 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 stronger forever, right? There's going to be peaks and valleys there. And again, thinking of lots of factors that can influence how you're adapting. So let's talk about those early adaptations, what happens neurologically. So very important is early on, what is happening? You're learning how to do those resistance exercises. So there's a lot of learning here and a lot of improvement in skill and coordination. So we're trying to learn how to activate our muscles to perform different exercises, right? So this is where the machines, you know, some people might be learning on machines or doing body weight exercises or resistance band exercises and learning technique. And so again, once a client is improved with their technique, you're going to see, you know, they're going to be able to get stronger because now they're better able to recruit those muscles to then perform those exercises, right? And hopefully eventually lift more weight. And so when we're doing this, we have things that are happening inside our body. So we're going to have an increased neural drive, and this is from the brain to the spinal cord to the muscles, right? To contract them. And so we're going to have a stronger and an increased drive to those muscles to contract them. We're going to have an increased firing rate. So we're going to get more action potentials, if you remember that term, but more firing to activate those motor units so we can contract the muscles, right? Versus like, this is your firing rate before, this is after, right? So we can, you know, better able recruit those motor units and recruit them faster. And we're going to come to this in a chart in a second, but high threshold motor units. So we're better able to recruit these. And what are actually your high threshold motor units? Those are actually your type 2A fibers and type 2X fibers. So type 2A and type 2X. Those are technically your high threshold motor units. What does that mean? When you activate these motor units, so type 2A, type 2X motor units, you can actually produce more force because those type 2 fibers are producing more force. So think of it this way. So let's say I was just going for a walk, okay? Don't need much force, just walking. I'm going to be mostly recruiting type 1 fibers. Let's say I started picking up my pace and I started like sprinting a little bit, not full out, but a little bit. I'm going to start recruiting type 2A because I need more force to run faster. And then I'm going all out as hard as I can. Then I'm going to recruit my type 2X fibers because I need as much force as possible to go as fast as possible. And maybe thinking of it in maybe resistance training sense where I lift a light 5-pound dumbbell. Okay, easy bicep curls, 5 pounds. Okay, I'm going to recruit only type 1 because I can do that really easily. Then, okay, let's add some weight. Let's do 10 pounds. Okay, now I got some type 2A turning on. Okay, more weight. That's harder, right? More force required to move that weight. Okay, you know what? I want to go all out here. I'm going to go 20 pounds per arm and I'm going to do bicep curls. And that's going to be, you know, 8 reps and that's my max out. I might be, you know, getting some type 2X fibers turned on then because I need more force with those fibers to help lift the weight. Okay. And so when we adapt to training, we're better able to turn on and recruit these high threshold motor units, those type 2A, type 2X. For someone who is learning and a beginner, they're most likely going to be type 1 and a little bit of their type 2A fibers they can turn on. But as their skill and coordination improves, they're better able to get more type 2A fibers recruited, and potentially as someone gets more advanced to the type 2X. And once we have type 1, type 2A, and type 2X fibers turned on all at the same time, that's maximal force production. I have all my fibers firing so I can produce as much force as possible. And that's how it works. It's usually, again, type 1, then type 2A, then type 2X. Usually you're not going to say, oh, I'm recruiting type 1. Okay, turn them off. Okay, type 2A now, turn them off. Okay, type 2X. No. Once type 1 is on, it's more like a continuum rather than a light switch. Type 1 is on, then type 2A adds on to the type 1, and then the type 2X. So they're all then recruited at the same time. You're never going to have only type 2X recruited and then everything else is off. Okay, and again, that makes sense because we want to recruit as much muscle as possible so we can, produce as much force as possible. And so once we've kind of gotten these adaptations kind of to their max level, and we already are, good at recruiting those muscles, and our skill is improved and our coordination, which might take a lot of time for some people. But then later on after that, that's when hypertrophy is going to drive the increases in strength. Okay. All right. Oops. I'm drawing on here. Don't want to draw. So here's the chart I'm talking about. So we can see here in the green, we have type 1 fibers, and in the yellow, it's type 2. Okay. So again, we're looking at force production here on that x-axis at the bottom, and then recruitment threshold, right? So being able to recruit all the way up to basically your type 2X at the top. So if I'm going to draw on or write on here, so up here would be your type 2X at the top. That's like, your maximal recruitment. Okay. And then in the middle, and so the smaller circles here, like your type 2A, and then at the bottom would be like type 1, right? And so again, if we want to produce more force, then again, I need to get to the type 2X. But if I'm not producing a lot of force, I'm mostly going to just be recruiting my type 1 fibers. Okay. And that's where aerobic activity, a lot of just steady state aerobic, not much force required, you're mostly recruiting type 1 fibers. And if that's all you do, you're probably never really going to get to your type 2X. Okay. Recruitment. So if I wanted to produce more force, then I might start getting into some of these yellow, bigger yellow circles here, the type 2A fibers, as my force production increases. And so then we're going to kind of have all of these turned on, and I'll try my best to kind of draw what I'm talking about here. So let's say again, like I'm get more force. So now I have these ones turned on, for example. And then, okay, I'm going to go all out. I'm going to try and lift as much weight as possible. Let's say deadlift for 1 rep max. Then I get all these fibers turning on. And again, that will only happen once you're more trained and you're able to recruit all your fibers. And that's, again, part of your adaptation that happens. So we can get maximal force production. Okay, so it's never like, okay, I turn my green on, the type 1, okay, turn them off. Then the type 2A on, turn them off. We don't do that. We just all on, or a little bit of type 1, then type 2A, then type 2X. Okay, and we can't skip. It's not like, oh, I recruit my type 1, then skip to type 2X. No, that is the order of how we recruit our motor units. Okay, any questions about that? I just want to make sure that makes sense. If anyone has questions about that, and feel free to say no, we're good. Okay, thank you, George. And did you learn that already? And again, I'm not sure what you guys know already. Did you learn like threshold? Recruitment threshold? Yeah, it's just been a while, I'm sure. Okay, well, let's continue. I'll just erase that.
Yeah, some of the notes remind me of exercise physiology.
That is what we're talking about.
Yeah, pretty much the same like graph. Even I think I've seen it before sometimes in that textbook.
Okay, sorry, I couldn't hear you there. There was a car driving or something.
Yeah, no, I think I've seen those graphs in our textbook, in our exercise physiology textbook.
Yep, that's where they're from. Awesome. Okay, good. So it's not like completely new information. It's just kind of more review for you. Awesome. Okay, so let's talk about some acute changes, muscular changes during resistance training. So we talked about some of these already, right? So when we fatigue, if we're fatiguing the muscle during resistance training, we're going to see a decrease in our creatine phosphate concentration, as I said, and our glycogen concentration, right? Because we're using our ATP-CP system, right? And the only way we can replenish our creatine phosphate stores is during rest. You have to rest. You can't just keep going. You actually have to rest to replenish. And that's where if you're doing like 1 rep max or strength, very heavy, less, very heavy and less reps, that's what I meant to say, you will need to rest. And that's why you need like 2 to 5 minutes rest to kind of replenish that creatine phosphate so you can use it again for that force production during, again, the next set. We also, as I said, use glycogen. And so about 80% of ATP production during like bodybuilding type resistance training. And again, this is like that hypertrophy or like 6 to 12, 8 to 12 reps. Again, fatiguing the muscle and mechanical tension, as we talked about, like, again, pushing some weight to stimulate that muscle. A lot of it is from glycolysis. So we're actually using glycolysis for most of our hypertrophy training. And again, this is bodybuilding type training. And so if we're working at a high intensity with resistance training, we're going to see the glycogen levels decrease because we're using anaerobic glycolysis. And this is where you might feel the burn at the end. If you're feeling that burn, that is your anaerobic glycolysis, right? Because we're producing lactic acid, we're producing hydrogen ions, and it's those hydrogen ions that are contributing to feeling that burn, right? If you didn't feel the burn, you're in an aerobic system. And most of the time, if you're doing high intensity resistance training, you're not working aerobically, okay? So understanding that most of our ATP production during bodybuilding type training is actually glycolysis. Okay, so what's happening chronically when we do resistance training? Well, we know we have hypertrophy taking place, right? And so the muscle fiber will get larger. And again, it's mostly the type 2 fibers. The type 1, there's no change, right? Because again, we need to recruit those type 2 fibers to produce more force. And those are the ones that will respond to the load and the resistance that you're putting on it. And so what actually happens, we actually get more contractile protein. So thinking of I don't know if I want to draw, maybe if you can just watch me, but we have our muscle fiber, right? And so inside that muscle fiber, so this is before and after, it's going to get bigger. Obviously, that's not that size unless you have huge muscle fibers, but it's going to get bigger. And inside there, we're going to have more actin and myosin. Okay, so we can actually get more contractile proteins. And so we're going to have more myofibrils, which is our actin and myosin. We're going to have, they'll even be a little larger, and we're going to have more of them. Okay. But we can't grow new muscle fibers, okay? And that's going to come up in the next slide. You're not going to get more of these. So you're not going to get more, you're going to get larger and then more actin myosin inside, okay? So you can't grow new muscle. That's one thing that might be a misconception for some people, is you think you can grow new muscle. No, they just get bigger, okay? Another thing too is that the connective tissue surrounding the muscle fibers also, it gets stronger, and so that's again like including your tendons and your ligaments as well. And as I said, we can also convert type 2X to type 2A. Okay, and that's what happens with resistance training. So we don't really involve the type 1 fibers. It's the type 2X to type 2A, and that's what we want, because the type 2X fatigue really easily. So that means you'd only be able to do a few reps and fatigue. So we want to be able to handle a little bit longer, right? A few more reps rather than like 2 reps and that's it. So that's where type 2A, that's kind of the ideal of what you want, right? You might, think, yeah, type 2X, you can produce the most force with them, but they fatigue really easily, which is not going to be beneficial, because then you'll do like 1 rep and be tired. So it's a good thing to have the type 2A fibers, okay? So there is another video. Again, this is posted for you on DC Connect, does explain the different fiber type transitions and what happens. I do recommend watching it. It explains everything in a little bit more detail. So again, we'll see on our timing at the end if there's any videos you want to watch together, or I do recommend please watch them on your own time. Okay, here's the image I'm talking about of explaining hypertrophy here. And so pretend this is like your bicep, this whole muscle here, right? And so inside we have our muscle fibers. So, you know, as we get here, and inside the muscle fiber, we have the actin and myosin, right? And those are your myofibrils. And I'll draw where I'm looking here. So here, inside here, that's where your actin and myosin are. And so we'll get more of those. And then this part gets bigger. Okay, so that's what gets bigger. So basically it goes from that size, and I'll just draw over muscle fiber, but it goes to that size. Again, not exactly to scale here, but understanding it gets bigger. Okay, and so we don't get what you might think happens is this hyperplasia. We don't get more muscle fibers. So you're never going to get more of them. Whatever you have will just get bigger. So think of it like inflating. And then when you stop training for a longer period of time, when you feel like, where did my muscle go? It will just kind of shrink back down, but you're not losing muscle fiber. It's not like, oh, we're going to delete some, right? Just shrinking back down. Okay, so the hypertrophy kind of goes back to where it was before. So that's important to understand the difference between these two terms. And what's actually happening is increase in muscle fiber size. And yes, we get more actin and myosin. Okay. Now, one thing you might be asking is, okay, if I stop training, you know, how quick till I start losing everything, right? So I'll tell you, the good news is that with resistance training, you don't lose it as fast as you do with cardio or aerobic training. So what usually happens first with the resistance training is the hypertrophy. You will start, you know, depending how long. If it's a week, you're not going to lose much. But let's say like 3 to 6 months, right? You will probably see some decrease in muscle size. Okay. Your muscle's not just withering away, okay, unless, you know, you're not eating or you got really sick or something. In that case, potentially you could be losing a little bit of muscle mass. But understand just everything's kind of shrinking back. And so that happens first. However, it does take longer for your strength to go away, not go away, but decrease, okay? And so you might find that, you know, if you stopped training for 6 months and you came back after 6 months, you would not be at the level you were when you first started resistance training, okay? You still, and so a huge part is that skill and the coordination that you've already learned of how to recruit your muscles and, you know, how to perform exercises properly and with good form, right? And so you didn't lose that, right? Usually it's like riding a bike. You can remember how to do like a row. So you won't probably be where you first started. Now, again, if you stop training for like 8 years, yeah, you'll probably be back from scratch, right? But it does take a lot longer to lose your strength than it does for aerobic training. So just something to think about if that was a question you might have been thinking of is, you know, how long does it take to lose everything? It takes quite a while. You'll notice that if you went to go back to train after a certain period of time, you actually didn't lose as much as you probably thought. Muscle memory, it's not really that it remembers, it's that like those neural adaptations, it's not like you're gonna just like everything's gonna get lost, right? So you've already built those motor units and that connection and those connections. You might lose like a little bit, but you're not going to be back to like ground zero where you first started. And again, that's more, it's not like your muscle has a memory, but that's you and your brain and your mind muscle connection of knowing how to perform exercises properly. And so it'll be easier to come back. And then again, it does take longer to lose strength. And hypertrophy, you will lose some muscle size. It will happen, but again, you'll be able to gain it back. It's not like you lose it and you'll never be able to gain it again. So I wouldn't really call it muscle memory, but yes, you can go back and it's going to be usually easier than it was when you first started training. Okay. So we'll talk about some endocrine changes. And again, that's your hormones, right? Of what's happening chronically. So we know that acutely, right, we're going to have increased epinephrine, increased cortisol, increased testosterone, increased growth hormone. We talked about that in the previous chart. And so what is the purpose of epinephrine and cortisol is to really mobilize those fuel sources so we can use glucose for fuel and we can mobilize our fuel so we can, you know, create ATP so we can have our muscles contract, right? So epinephrine actually helps with the breakdown of fat and carbohydrates, glycogen, so we can make more ATP available, as I said. And also epinephrine helps as priming that central nervous system to facilitate activation of our motor units, which is good, right? That fight or flight, activate those muscles so we can fight, right? And then the cortisol is also helping with maintaining your blood glucose levels and breaking down glycogen. Okay, and so that's a huge role of these two hormones. And then testosterone and growth hormone are basically going to help assist with that protein synthesis and to build muscle. Okay, and so we will see shortly after training an increase in these concentrations of the hormones to help with the stimulation of growth of muscle, right? And that's where people will take these extra supplements to help with muscle growth, right? I'm sure you've heard people taking growth hormone or testosterone. Yes, it will help, but there's a lot of negative side effects of taking these performance enhancing drugs, but they work. Obviously it will work, but not the safest thing to do. Yes, we have a greater increase in testosterone and growth hormone in males than females, okay? And if we were performing a session with a lot of larger muscle mass recruited, so like, you know, our lats, our legs, in bigger muscle groups, we're gonna have a stronger response with these hormones. If we also perform higher volume with shorter rest, we will see also, again, increases in responses to these hormones. And if you're younger, you will see higher increases as well. So if you're just doing, you know, really light resistance training, nothing crazy, you're not going to see as much of a response as if you were working intensely here. Okay. So here comes a question you might have. So if you do resistance training, will that affect your cardiorespiratory adaptations? So let's say you were a runner and you decided you wanted to start some resistance training. Is it going to affect your running? Now, if you're going to go start resistance training 5 days a week and run 5 days a week, yes, it will. But let's just say you're adding in like 2 to 3 days a week, you know, muscular endurance level resistance training, or even strength, we can say, or hypertrophy. So understanding, again, resistance training does depend on glycolysis and anaerobic metabolism. So different systems, we're not really working our aerobic system. And yes, it can help increase muscular endurance, as we talked about, right? Because we're able to last a whole hour session performing our exercises, right? But not to the same extent as if I was going for a run. Now, evidence shows that resistance training will not improve your VO2. Okay, so it's not going to improve like your VO2 max. Peak VO2, again, that's just kind of the highest level you get to if you were doing a VO2 max test. But we don't see it's going to help with improving your VO2. And it doesn't reduce your cardiovascular endurance. So does resistance training negatively affect your cardiorespiratory adaptations? No. Will it improve your cardiorespiratory fitness? No. Okay, unless you were doing resistance training with lower weight, higher reps, and you're going for like, you know, fatiguing and like really high reps, perhaps at that point, if you're doing more like HIIT or circuit type training, yes, it'll probably improve your VO2 max. But if you're just doing like, you know, bodybuilding type training, we're not going to really see much of an improvement in your VO2. Good question there, Katie. What's the difference between peak and absolute? Okay, so there's VO2 max and VO2 peak. So VO2 max is like hitting your true max. Basically, here, let me draw this curve for you if I can draw. I'll do my best. So VO2 max, if you were to do it and chart it out, it will look something like that. You'll have a plateau, okay? VO2 peak, we don't have a plateau. This is just the highest level you got, and we don't know if that was your true VO2 max or not. You could have just said, I'm done, I can't continue anymore. There would have been maybe a reason why you didn't continue. So this is without reaching your plateau. That would be a peak. And you were asking as well, absolute VO2. We can compare absolute to relative VO2. So absolute VO2 is just like in liters per minute. And so that's just kind of like your absolute number. When we talk about relative VO2, that's related to body weight. And that's where we can compare two individuals, right? Because you might have, let's say, you know, two males, one is 70 kilos, one is 50 kilos. Both their absolute number is 3 liters per minute. And if you actually converted it to absolute, we could probably see that the 50 kilo person might have a higher VO2 if you did it relative to their body weight. So there's just 4 different terms here. There's the VO2 max, VO2 peak, And then absolute and relative VO2, those are all like different definitions. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? And maybe I went too fast. So this would be your VO2 max. Got it? And this would be like VO2 peak, right? Where you're not at a true max, that's just the highest level you got. Okay. So understanding resistance training is not going to improve your VO2, okay, unless you're doing it in a format that is more muscular endurance and you're actually in that target heart rate zone and you're reaching a target heart rate zone that will give you those adaptations. But again, if you're just doing 6 to 12 reps, 8 to 12, whatever, you're probably not going to see improvements, okay? But it does not negatively affect your cardiovascular endurance, okay? Hopefully that answers any questions about that, okay? All right, so again, what can influence our ability to adapt, right? So unfortunately, we know at the bottom there, genetics, that will play a role. However, that is not the end of the world. That doesn't mean you'll never be able to adapt to anything, right? So we'll come back to that, but let's start with specificity. So first of all, is your program specific to your goals? Is it, if you want to build muscle, is your program, you know, built to help you build muscle, right? And so we need to follow that principle of specificity, and that's where the program is very important as well. Then looking at gender, sorry, females, it's harder to build muscle than males, okay? Males have a lot more testosterone than females, and females just generally have less muscle per pound of body weight as well. Does it mean women cannot build muscle? No, it's just going to be a little bit harder. And again, you're not going to get big and bulky. So that is a huge myth that, you know, females are going to get big and bulky if they do resistance training. No, you don't. And anyone you see on Instagram or the internet, again, if they're huge and they're females, they're probably taking something to help them get there, okay? Especially all the CrossFit women who are huge, yeah, that's not natural, okay? Plus they train like all day long too. So just understanding that again, yes, we can build muscle, just not to the same extent as males. Also age, so we know as we get older, sarcopenia, that's what I explained. As we get older, we lose muscle mass. Are we going to wither away? No, right? But resistance training will help, as we said, attenuate that muscle loss. So instead of seeing like a steep decline, it won't be as steep, okay? And again, you might be able to maintain for a bit longer than someone who's not doing any resistance training. We talked about this as well, that we can also improve bone mineral density with resistance training and reduce the risk of osteoporosis. And that's very important. So genetics, here's one thing, and maybe I have a question for you guys coming. So percentage of type 1 and type 2 fibers. You are born with a certain percentage of type 1 and type 2 fibers, and you cannot change type 1 to type 2X and type 2X to type 2 to type 1. So you are born with a certain ratio of fibers. So you might notice that you find that you are better at endurance activity. You can last a long time. That's kind of easier for you to do. And that would mean you're probably more type 1 dominant. On the other hand, you might find, you know what, I'm strong and powerful. I can actually, you know, lift quite a bit of weight and I feel really powerful, but my endurance kind of sucks. Like I fatigue pretty quick. That might mean you have a higher percentage of type 2. If you find you're somewhere in the middle, and you're like, yeah, I have some good endurance and yeah, I have, you know, some good explosive strength, you might find that you're kind of like in the middle, you're 50-50 almost. So I was going to ask you what you think based on your experience with training. Do you think you might be more type 1 dominant or type 2? And I'll tell you from my experience, I think I'm more type 1 dominant, because when I try resistance training and try to go heavy like a powerlifting program, I can go near my max for a few reps, but once I go up a little bit, like I don't have that explosive power, because I feel like, again, for me, I am more type 1 dominant and I like that endurance and I'm kind of better at it than I am with that high weight and low reps. So that's just me, but again, not saying you can't train that way. It's just going to be a little harder for some people. Some people it's easy, right? They're like, yeah, I got this, and like very explosive and powerful, right? But yeah, so I see, Taylor, you said type 2. So yeah, you're more explosive and powerful. Anyone else, what you think you might be? And again, you can tell based on your experience with training. There you go, George, more type 1. Yeah. And there is a way to test it where you can actually do like a muscle biopsy and they can see kind of percentages of the type 1 and 2 fibers. Some people might be more of just a hybrid 50-50 between both. So yeah, type 1 there, Chantel, yeah. Yeah, again, whatever you feel like is easier for you to do, right? So whatever, I mean, if maybe you do notice, again, doing those like weights and heavier weights, it's easier for you, feel more explosive, might be more type 2. Yeah, so everyone's going to be different, and that is genetics as well. But then again, that doesn't mean you can't do anything. But unfortunately, you know, like, hey, I want to be like Usain Bolt, or I want to be like Michael Phelps. Well, probably won't, right? There is some genetic limits to things, right? Awesome. So cool. So again, based on that, you can kind of just get an idea of like, where are my strengths? And then, you know, there's some people like they do a little bit of resistance training, they build muscle really easily. There's like, and we call them like genetic freaks, right? Or you're like, how do you lift that much weight? How did you go, you know, get stronger so quickly? Probably more type 2 dominant, right? That's just their genetics. And some people are more genetically gifted than others. And that is kind of what it is. But some people will just have to work more harder to reach their goals than others. And that's just how it is. All right, awesome. So aerobic training adaptations, are we good to keep going? I assume no one ever wants a break anymore, so I will keep going unless we have a vote for a break.
I'm good to go.
Awesome. Okay, unless someone, you know, insists we need a break, you tell me, but I will keep going. So let's talk about aerobic adaptations now. So we're going to see very different things that are happening here. We're going to be looking at like the heart, the blood, the lungs, the muscle, and see some different changes that happen. Okay, so let's just talk about, hey, I decided to go out the door and go for a run. Okay, what's going to happen? My heart rate's going to go up. My cardiac output is going to go up. I'm going to come back to that in 1 second. My oxygen consumption will go up, which is like your VO2, right? My ventilation is going to go up. I'm going to breathe faster and deeper. My blood pressure, my systolic blood pressure will go up, but not much change in my diastolic blood pressure. We'll talk about that. You shouldn't see much of a change in your diastolic blood pressure. And we're also going to see vasodilation. Does anyone remember what is vasodilation? Yeah, you're basically there, Jordan. I would just rephrase it and say increasing diameter of the blood vessels. Okay, and so if we have increased diameter of our blood vessels, that's going to allow more blood flow. We can get better oxygen delivery to our tissues. We can get better removal of CO2, which we don't want, and we can get better delivery of like glucose and what we need to the muscles, right? So that's what happens during exercise. We're going to get vasodilation happening. And then coming back to cardiac output, let's review cardiac output because you do need to understand what that is. So cardiac output is a combination of, see what we remember, heart rate and stroke volume. I'll put stroke volume because you might not remember what SV stands for. Heart rate and stroke volume. And we know that stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped out of the heart ventricle per beat. Okay, so how much blood is leaving the heart per beat? So stroke volume. So both go up during exercise, and we're going to go through a chart of reviewing what happens. Okay, so again, I decided I'm going to get up, go for a run. All these changes are going to happen acutely. Okay. So here we go. This chart is looking at cardiac output. Okay, we know again, cardiac output is a combination of heart rate and stroke volume. And I'll write it again just to review. And remember, we write cardiac output as Q, right? Cardiac output Q equals heart rate times SV, stroke volume. Okay, so just remember that. So we're looking here at basically progressive exercise to maximal intensity. So we're going submaximal to maximal intensity. And what do we see happening? Okay, so firstly, we see heart rate go up, right? And that's quite a linear increase. We can see heart rate is linearly going up as the intensity goes up. And I think we know that already, right? Until we get to our maximal level, which could be around, let's say, like 200. Okay, and so that happens. Great. Okay, what else do we see happening? Stroke volume. Okay, again, that is the amount of blood pumped by the heart per beat. What happens? Okay, it's going to increase during some maximal, then we see a plateau and it levels off, even during maximal exercise. Why does stroke volume plateau? What is the reason why stroke volume plateaus? Exactly, Katie. Yeah. The heart can only stretch so much to get so much blood in it, right? You can't just, literally stretch the heart out to get as much blood in, right? It's only going to stretch to a certain size. And again, the ventricle can only pump so much blood out, right? We get to its maximal capacity. So that's why we see a plateau. The heart has maximized its ability to fill with blood and then maximize its ability to inject the blood out so we can deliver it where it needs to go. So basically, what is the main driver for increased cardiac output? We could say around like 50 to 60% of our maximal capacity. The main driver for increases in cardiac output, around this 50 to 60% here, is the heart rate. Okay, and so yes, cardiac output goes up, right? And stroke volume will plateau, but then cardiac output will still go up because heart rate goes up. And hope that makes sense. Okay, so we'll talk about what happens chronically and our adaptations, and I hope you remember it's something to do with stroke volume. We'll talk about that. Okay, does that make sense? Are we good with this chart here to understand what is driving the increase in cardiac output as we progress to maximal exercise? It's going to be heart rate. We good with that? Hope so. I'm not getting any questions, so let's continue. Okay, thank you, Taylor. I'll take that as a yes for everyone. All right, so I'll just clear that. Okay, so let's talk about blood pressure response, and I mentioned that already. We see systolic blood pressure increase and diastolic blood pressure doesn't really change. And in this graph here, we're looking at progressive increase intensity as well. And so here, this number, we see 1, 2, 3, 4. That is your absolute VO2, right? And so that's what I mentioned earlier, which means it does not relate to body weight, right? So you can't really compare two individuals with an absolute number. So that's your absolute VO2. Doesn't really matter. The idea here is that we're looking at increasing intensity. Okay, so regardless of what we're measuring. And so as the intensity goes up, systolic blood pressure will go up. Okay, and as intensity goes up, diastolic doesn't really change. It might decrease slightly, as you can see here, maximal, but decrease very, very little, if anything, but you could just say no change. Okay, so that's what happens. Okay, if I were to just, go at 50% capacity, maintain that for time, then my systolic blood pressure will go up and then plateau, right? It's not going to keep going up if my intensity does not. So it's only with progressive increase in intensity. Otherwise, my blood pressure will go up to whatever it needs to at that intensity, and then it will plateau. Okay, so that is the response to progressive aerobic exercise. We will see increase in systolic, not much change in diastolic. Now let's just think resistance training. We do see increases exactly the same way in systolic and diastolic. So systolic will go up, especially if you do that Valsalva maneuver when you hold your breath. We can see really, really high numbers of systolic, like over 250 sometimes, but it's very transient, right? Because you're doing that for 1 to whatever, a few reps if you're doing Valsalva and you're going heavy, and it's not a bad thing. It's very quick, and then right after you kind of breathe again, your blood pressure will come back down, right? But understanding that happens with resistance training, but diastolic shouldn't really change again the same way. Okay. All right, let's continue. So here we go, is that summary chart from your textbook of acute responses to cardiovascular training. So we'll go through some of them. Again, I'm not going to go through every single one in detail, but just to highlight some key things that happen, and I already explained some of them, right? We know heart rate goes up, stroke volume, cardiac output. So we're good with all those. I want you to remember the term total peripheral resistance. Hopefully you might remember that. And so that, like another way to say that is like, how hard is it for the blood to flow? Okay. And so if we have a decrease in resistance, that means it's easier for blood to flow. Why? The vasodilation, right? We're getting increased diameter of our vessels, which means it's going to be easier for blood to flow. Okay. We're going to get more blood flow to the muscle, less blood flow to our organs, because again, we're not worried about rest and digest. We're trying to, get the delivery of our nutrients to our muscle. We see again, systolic goes up, no change in diastolic. We'll kind of skip some of the other ones there, and then some respiratory changes acutely, right? So we're going to breathe faster. We're going to breathe deeper. So tidal volume, that's the amount of air you're breathing in and out per breath. You're going to be able to breathe a little bit more. Okay. And so that will then increase your pulmonary ventilation, which means that's a combination of your rate and how deep you're breathing, that will go up, right? Metabolic changes, okay, increasing oxygen consumption, right? That's like VO2. Blood lactate will go up, okay? You are still, going to create some energy anaerobically, depending on your intensity. The higher your intensity, more blood lactate. Blood pH decrease. What happens when blood pH decreases? Is that more acidic or more basic? Blood pH decrease, more acidic, more basic? Which one? Basic. Acidic. Okay. So when blood pH goes down, more acidic. Now, again, it's a very small change. It might be like 7.4 to 7.3, not a huge difference. If we get too much of a decrease in our blood pH, that's where bad things happen. Our enzymes can't function. So it's a very small decrease. It might even be like 7.4 to 7.35, something small, right? But we see that go down because increase in hydrogen ion, and that is part of the lactate production. Okay, also arteriovenous oxygen difference, that is the amount of oxygen is taking up by your muscles, going to go up. And again, this is acutely, we're going to take more oxygen in. And so that means we'll have less oxygen on the venous side going back to the heart because we took it in the muscle. Endocrine changes. So we see increase. And so interesting here. So catecholamines, remember what catecholamines are? Maybe, maybe not. Anyone? So that's like your epinephrine, norepinephrine. So we see an increase in those, again, helping mobilize fuel as well. And again, part of that fight or flight response, exercise is considered a stress on our body. We see an increase in glucagon. Glucagon, what's the role of glucagon? It's to break down glycogen to glucose. We need to do that during exercise. What does insulin do? It does the opposite. It stores glucose in the form of glycogen. Well, why would we want to store glucose during exercise? So we don't really need an insulin increase during exercise, right? It actually decreases. Then we see cortisol. Interesting that we see that during low to moderate intensity exercise, it actually decreases. But if we're working at a higher intensity, we'll see a higher increase in cortisol. Quite interesting. Now, again, everything will go back to normal after. We know that, high levels of cortisol long-term is not good for you, but exercise is a good stress placed on your body, and you will go back to a normal level after exercise, depending, again, how hard you're working. The harder you're working, cortisol will go up higher. And growth hormone will also increase, okay? Just as the same as resistance training. So let's go through the chronic adaptations to aerobic training. I'm going to show you with some pictures here rather than in the chart format. And then you'll see the summary chart after, which is kind of the same thing as we're going to go through now. So this is why it was important to understand cardiac output and what stroke volume is, right? Stroke volume, the amount of blood my heart can pump out per beat. It will increase. Stroke volume will go up with chronic adaptation, which is a really cool adaptation your ventricle size actually gets larger. And that means we can pump more blood out per beat, which will then help our heart rate because our heart doesn't have to pump as fast to get the same amount of blood around the body. And so that is also a reason why our resting heart rate goes down, because I can pump more blood per beat. My heart doesn't have to work as hard. And so during rest, my heart rate goes down. Now, again, does it need to go to 40? No, but some, really elite athletes who are marathon runners and high level, endurance trained athletes, you're going to see low resting heart rates close to 40. I would say most people, who are well endurance trained, you might see 50 to 60 as a resting heart rate. Okay. And again, this is beneficial, especially as we get older. We don't want to have a resting heart rate of 80, 90. That means our heart's working way harder at rest, right? And that's more stress on the heart long term. So that's a beneficial adaptation as well. And another important one is cardiac output increases during maximal exercise. Not some maximal exercise. Let's come back. So let's go back to this chart. So what does that mean? So this one here. So stroke volume is higher during maximal exercise. Okay, so why is that? And submaximal, it doesn't change, okay? So one thing to note quickly first is that during submaximal exercise, my cardiac output will not change, even though I'm more fit. Why? Well, if I can pump more blood per beat, so if I'm pumping, let's say, let me draw here if I can. So if I can pump more blood per beat, so let's say I'm gonna go up to, I don't know, 130. So I can pump more blood per beat, for example, okay? Then again, my heart actually doesn't need to work as hard to get the same amount of blood pumped around. So you're gonna see kind of this curve, that's a really bad line, but anyway, something like that. That my heart doesn't have to work as hard to get the same amount of blood pumped through, right? Which is good. So that means during submaximal exercise, my heart rate will be lower, okay? So here's an example. Let's say week 1, okay? I decided to run 5K, okay? My average heart rate as I was running 5K was 160, okay? Week 1. I started an aerobic training program. I continued that for 8 weeks, and it was a good program, okay? 8 weeks. I went to do that exact same 5K run I did in week 1, the same pace, okay? So if I adapted and my stroke volume increased, my heart rate, let's say it's now 145 during my whole run, okay? So before, when I first started, it was 160, now it's 145 with the exact same pace. I'm not going harder, it has to be the same intensity, submaximal. My heart rate's lower. Why? Because my stroke volume's higher and I can pump more blood per beat. My heart doesn't have to work as hard. Now, on the other hand, as I mentioned, if we do maximal exercise, we can see if I'm at maximal exercise, if my stroke volume is higher, right, and I'm pumping more blood per beat because I can, and my heart rate is at its maximal level, then I will have a maximal cardiac output that will be higher, right, because my stroke volume's higher. So if you want to see some numbers, for example, just to kind of make it make sense, it's just right on the side here. So let's say my stroke volume before I started training, I don't know, was 120. Now when I adapted, it went to 130, right? And if we know cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume, right? Okay, well, if I'm going as hard as I can, my heart rate is 200 and my stroke volume was 120, we'll get some answer there, doing the math. Why won't it fix? Move over, okay, there. And if I was now doing the exact same thing, let's say again, it's my 8 weeks later, my cardiac output is now 200 times 130. Well, obviously we're gonna get a higher number, right? If obviously I'm doing 200 times 130, if that makes sense, because I'm pumping more blood per beat and I'm going at maximal intensity. So there would be me trained maximal level, my heart rate will still be at its max, okay? So that's why during maximal exercise, heart rate goes up with training, sorry, not heart rate, cardiac output goes up with training, okay, because of the increase in stroke volume. All right, hopefully that makes sense. We will come back to the other slide. Yeah, more efficient heart, exactly. So submaximal we don't change, but maximal we do. Okay, so there we go. That's the heart. We can pump more blood per beat. Awesome. Stroke volume goes up. Let's look at blood volume. Blood volume goes up. Okay, so we're going to actually have more red blood cells in our blood and higher hemoglobin levels, which means we're better able to deliver oxygen. What does hemoglobin do? Those are oxygen carriers. So if we have more hemoglobin, we can deliver more oxygen. And this is where, again, if you were to take some performance enhancing drugs, people take like EPO or take, put in blood, their own blood, through like blood doping, you can increase your blood volume that way, right? And you'll have more red blood cells. So that is the idea of doing that, because it will help with better oxygen delivery to the muscle. So we can create ATP aerobically, right? So again, that is an adaptation that will happen even if you don't take drugs, right? But if you wanted even higher levels, then that's what people do. However, it's not safe because your blood can get really thick and viscous, and then you're at risk for clots and you could have like a stroke or a heart attack. So that's why it's not good to do that. But again, when you're at that high level, people will do what it takes. So that is an adaptation that happens. More red blood cells and again, more hemoglobin. Then at the lung level, we have muscles that surround the lungs to help us breathe. For example, our internal and external intercostals around the ribs. Those are muscles that help you breathe. Well, if they are muscles, they can adapt. So the actual muscles that help with ventilation, the endurance will increase, right? Because if I'm breathing heavier and deeper and I'm doing that for a period of time, those muscles will adapt, right? And so we'll improve the endurance of these muscles. And they're mostly type 1, right? Obviously, it wouldn't make sense if those ventilatory muscles were type 2X, if we'd fatigue, we couldn't breathe, right? So again, very highly aerobic, and they will adapt to your training. Your VO2 max goes up. I'm assuming we know that already, right? Our maximal oxygen carrying capacity will go up with training. And as well, we won't have to breathe as hard during submaximal exercise. So maybe that's something you've noticed with maybe your training, that you shouldn't be breathing as heavy or as deep or as fast with, let's say that submaximal exercise. And coming back to my example of week 1, I ran 5K, right? My heart rate was 160 and I ran for 5K. 8 weeks later, I ran, now it was 145. Also, if I'm comparing my breathing was not, my ventilation was not as high during that week 8, right? Because it's not as hard on my body anymore. I don't need to breathe as fast and deep because, again, I can get more air in per breath as well. Everything's kind of just more efficient. My endurance of the muscles have gone up, so I don't have to breathe as hard to kind of get the oxygen in. Okay. Then another really awesome adaptation. Does anyone remember what angiogenesis is? Okay, angiogenesis. What is angiogenesis? This is the formation of new blood
Is it
vessels.
a
So,
formation? Oh, sorry.
oh,
You
sorry,
just
too
said
slow
it.
there, Jordan.
Yeah, sorry about that. Whoops.
No, don't worry. I was just joking. Yeah. Okay, you got it. Yes, I'm sure you were saying exactly what I was going to say. So we actually grow new capillaries, which is awesome. That is such a cool adaptation. So we actually grow new capillaries that are surrounding the muscle, which means we can get better oxygen delivery. We can get better CO2 removal, better delivery of glucose, all those things, right? So that's awesome. And blood pressure is another thing that happens, is it decreases with training. So that's a benefit, right? If someone was looking to manage blood pressure, exercise, aerobic training will do that. Will resistance training lower blood pressure? Not probably the same as with aerobic training. I would say no. So angiogenesis, again, we will form new capillaries. And unfortunately, if you stop training for a period of time, you will lose all these adaptations that I'm talking about. So you don't use it, you lose it. And you will lose it much quicker than your resistance adaptations, unfortunately. So again, if there's no stress being put on the heart, the lungs, your circulatory system, you will lose those adaptations. And so kind of just recycle those extra capillaries, but you can grow them back again if you were to start training. So like you could lose, like, again, if you did nothing for like a week, you would actually lose, there is a percentage, I believe it's like, there's a bed rest study where it was like 21 days, you lose about 25% on average of like basically your adaptations. In 3 weeks, you lose 1/4. Yes, we're going to get better oxygenation to the muscles with angiogenesis. And again, with all these adaptations, yes, correct. Okay. And then lastly, at the muscle level, we're going to have more mitochondria, which is great because that's where we make our ATP aerobically. More myoglobin, which is our oxygen carriers in the muscle, which is good. We can get better oxygen delivery inside the muscle. More glycogen stores, great. So we can mobilize more glucose, more triglyceride stores, so we can, mobilize those fuel sources to produce ATP. And again, this is all aerobically. More oxidative enzymes to, again, produce ATP aerobically. We also improve our lactate threshold, which means we won't feel that burn as early. It's going to happen later. Let's say this happened at like 50 to 60% of your maximal level. Now it's going to happen at like 70%. So you can work at a higher capacity before you start feeling that burn in, and that anaerobic system is what's contributing to energy production. So that's also a great adaptation, and our endurance goes up, muscular endurance. Okay. So all this happens in those type 1 fibers. So all these adaptations here are in your type 1 fibers. And remember, a lot of the resistance training adaptations we talked about, that was your type 2 fibers. Okay. All right. So this is just a summary chart. Oh, sorry, question?
Yeah, just a quick question. Like going back to muscle memory and what you're saying, if you're inactive, you can lose your adaptations. Is there a number for specifics? Like, let's say someone was injured, they were off playing sports for 3 months, and then they wanted to gain back that ability. Would it take them longer to get their ability back once they're ready to go? Or will there be like a specific based on the individual, I guess?
Yeah, it's going to be based on that individual, depending on the level you were at. I would say, again, the more advanced you are, it will be like easier to come back than someone who's just starting training from scratch. So it's really more individual based, I would say. And also depends how long you were off. The longer it is, obviously, the more you might lose. But I'm talking like years versus like a few months, right? Like 3 months, you're not going to lose that much as you think you might. But if you're off 2 years, you're going to lose a lot more than you would have in the 3 months, right? And again, depending at the level you were at, right? So it's going to be, I'm going to say there's not really a hard number, and it's more individual based on kind of what level you were at before.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, awesome. All right, so let's just look here and compare. Just we're looking at submaximal. So this is again the same. So if that week 1 I ran 5K at that pace, week 8 I ran at that same pace, and that's what I'm comparing as a chronic adaptation, not a faster pace, because then we can't compare, right? Because I'm going faster now, right? Yes, I'm faster, great, but I'm comparing the same intensity. So that's what we're seeing here with fixed submaximal exercise. And then we're comparing some of these adaptations versus rest, and then maximal exercise. So heart rate, we have a decreased resting heart rate. We know that. During submaximal exercise, we know it's lower, right? My heart is not going to have to work as hard because my stroke volume is higher. Maximal exercise doesn't change. We'll still hit a max heart rate. It's not like we can get a higher maximal heart rate. That doesn't happen. Okay. With stroke volume, we see an increase, right? And so we're able to pump more blood per beat, period, the end, no matter what you're doing. And you see an increase across the board here. Cardiac output, we only see it go up during maximal exercise. As we said, during submaximal exercise, we don't see a change in cardiac output. Reason being is that, again, because I can pump more blood per beat, my heart rate will adjust accordingly, and it'll be the same cardiac output, okay? Blood pressure, resting decreases both systolic and diastolic, okay? Not much change in maximal exercise, okay? Pulmonary ventilation, we said, again, decreases during submaximal. We don't have to breathe as hard. because it's easier on our body. It's not as stressful, whatever we're doing. But maximal exercise, we can actually get a higher pulmonary ventilation. Our pulmonary, our muscles surrounding the lungs are stronger. Plus, as well, we have more oxygen we can get in per breath, and we can breathe faster. We're just more efficient, right? And so we can get a higher ventilation at maximal exercise only. Okay. Oxygen consumption increases during maximal exercise. We can get a higher VO2 max, basically. But again, sub-maximal, we're not pushing it at a high intensity here. We're just, it's the same level that we did, let's say, week 1 versus week 8. We don't see much of a change. Again, we're going to kind of compensate to maintain the level of what we need. And then arteriovenous oxygen difference, that's how much oxygen we're taking in to the muscle, right? And so during maximal exercise, we can get more, but not much change in any other aspect, okay? So really cool just to compare between maximal, submaximal, and even during rest of what happens chronically, okay? Oops. Okay, and then just some more here. Again, the left ventricle, we know it gets larger. That's the systolic. The stroke volume goes up. Blood volume, we talked about that. And again, this is just basically the summary chart of the images that I showed you. So we'll just continue. And then the one thing I pointed out was type 1. We don't see much change in the cross-sectional area. So when you do a lot of endurance training, you're not going to get bigger, right? We see marathon runners, elite endurance athletes, they're not huge. They're very long and lean, right? And the muscles are actually going to be probably more dense, right? Of what you have, they don't get bigger, okay? We talked about all these, so we're going to just kind of move on from there. We talked about most of these, okay? Yes, you can lose fat mass with aerobic training. That's at the bottom here with body composition, and you could use aerobic training to help you lose weight. But as we know, it's important to also build muscle. That's important. Okay, and then performance, no changes in any power aspects unless you are doing that type of training. But yes, your cardiorespiratory endurance will go up, okay? Okay, just one thing to point out here about lower resting heart rate. So a beneficial aspect of a lower resting heart rate means that you're gonna have a higher parasympathetic activity, or we can call it parasympathetic tone. And remember the difference between sympathetic and parasympathetic, right? Sympathetic nervous system is that fight or flight response, and parasympathetic is rest and digest. We want to be in our resting state more parasympathetic. We don't want to be in a high sympathetic state all the time, which when we're stressed, we are, right? And so if we have a lower resting heart rate, this indicates that we have a higher parasympathetic tone, which is good, which means that, we're more relaxed, our body's more relaxed, and we can actually better recover from stress and recover from intense exercise. So that's a good thing. If you have a low resting heart rate, it means your body's not under too much stress. We're good, we're relaxed, okay? Not always the case for most of us, especially now as we get closer to exams. Probably we're going to be more of that sympathetic state, right? Now, the thing is, again, when we relate that to training, if you're stressed out all the time, if you're stressed with work, with life, right, with school and everything, if you went to the gym and you went, okay, you know what, I need to go hard and do high intensity workouts, that's actually going to put your body under more stress, and it's already stressing even at rest, when you actually just might benefit better from doing a steady state, nice and easy cardio session. It doesn't have to always be high intensity. So my recommendation is in periods of time where you feel stressed out, you maybe don't even feel like going to the gym, just to do like 20 to 30 minutes of steady state cardio, whatever equipment you want, walking, jogging, elliptical, bike, whatever you want, will probably be more beneficial to kind of bring you to more of that parasympathetic state than, hey, let's do a HIIT workout because I need to go hard. So that's just something to think about, that, your whole life, right? And not just like at the gym, right? So if you are stressed, maybe to just take more relaxing workouts to help relax you rather than, putting your body under more stress. And a way that you could monitor that is by your resting heart rate. If your resting heart rate is higher than normal, that might indicate you are, in more of that sympathetic state. So something to consider, to think about. And even if you have clients that are more stressed out, in times of the year, they might be more stressed with life or work, whatever it might be, to maybe just have some chill out workouts where you just do steady state, nice and easy. Cardio can still be beneficial and kind of, again, as I said, bring your body back to that more parasympathetic state that we want it to be. So hopefully maybe that's of interest to you. And then again, just summarizing the factors here that can influence our ability to adapt to endurance training. So we know, again, is the program specific? That's going to be important. Genetics, we know, do play a role, not a lot, 20 to 30%, but some people will just naturally have a higher VO2 max as well than others with the same amount of training. And that's just part of genetics as well. Sorry, females again, gender. So we have smaller hearts, lungs, and blood volume than males. Okay, but that does not mean that you can't adapt to endurance training. You just might have, smaller lung capacity. Your heart might not get to the same stroke volume as a male counterpart, right? But that's okay, right? Females are just not built the same way as males, and that's fine. So also with age, so we usually reach, for females, a VO2 max around 12 to 15. You kind of reach your peak, okay? Again, that's, and you if you train, you can still train it to go up. It's not like, oh, that's it, I can't get higher. But you might reach your highest at that age. And then for males, about 17 to 21 years old. Sorry, what happens after that? We start to plateau and then decrease as we age, okay? Now, we can attenuate this decline with training. So let's take a look at this interesting chart. And I hope you maybe have seen it or you find it really interesting. So let's first look at the untrained individual in the black line here. Okay, so we're looking at starting at 20 years old. Okay, so around 20, and this is in males, we see a peak VO2 max for someone who's untrained, let's say 42. Okay, if you did nothing your whole life and you never did any training, no aerobic training at all, you're going to see this type of a decrease. And by the age 70, you're going to see a VO2, let's say, 26, right? Just the high 20s, which is quite low. Okay. And you're probably going to be near that threshold of independence, which means it's going to be a lot harder to do your activities of daily living at that age. Okay. Now, if we compare to runners, okay, so we have three different aspects here looking at runners. So let's look at the high intensity runner in yellow at the top. So what we see is, again, this is at age 30, a VO2 starting around 70, which is really good. That's a good VO2. Now, if they continued their running throughout the rest of their life, we're going to see a decrease, but not much, up to 60 at age 70. That is a huge difference between the one who is, trained versus the one who's untrained. So that means they're going to have a higher workload capacity, easier to do activities of daily living, not fatigue as easily if you have that higher reserve and capacity. Let's say we had a runner now who, again, started at the same level and they reduced their intensity over time as they aged. We're going to see a decrease, not that bad, only to about like 50 here, just above 50. That's still pretty good VO2, especially when you're 70, right? There's some people who in their 20s will not reach a VO2 of 50, right? And then we have the runner who just stopped training. So 30, they decided, I'm good, I'm not going to run anymore. Look at how steep that decrease is here, and all the way down to mid 30s, which again, not the greatest VO2, but not as bad as someone who's untrained, even if you did something when you were 30. So that's nice to know that, hey, if I did some good aerobic training in my 30s, that's going to at least help me by the time I'm 70. So again, I would not stop training. We can attenuate the decline. We can probably just reduce the intensity and we'll still see a decline, just not as much. And then just looking at, let's say, the average person who's just doing some fitness training at the gym, they're not a runner specifically, right? So we can see VO2 max here again in the 20s at around mid 50s. Okay, it's not bad. And then they continue that their whole life. Okay, we see a decline, not too bad, to low 40s, which is not bad in your 70s. So the conclusion here is that if you don't do anything, that's going to be the worst case scenario. It's better to do something, whether it's any type of aerobic training, to try and maintain your VO2 and attenuate the decline, right? We can see the curves change if you did nothing versus maintaining something. So even if you had to reduce your intensity as you age, that's totally okay. as long as, you know, you're doing something. So hopefully this graph maybe is enlightening and maybe scares some of you that, oh, if I do nothing, like, you know, by the time I'm 70, I'm going to probably not be able to do much at that point, right? So something is better than nothing. As simple as just walking, if that's all you can do, that's fine. Again, if you do some higher intensity training, that's going to help improve your VO2, but whatever you can do just to keep moving and be physically active is what's going to prevent this situation from happening in the untrained individual. So hopefully that motivates you to do some aerobic training. Again, some of you might be on the other end of the spectrum where I love resistance training, not a big fan of aerobic training, just to do it for your health and for maintaining, again, your oxygen capacity, and then getting some of these adaptations as well will be beneficial, right? For everyone, it's good to do a combination of both, unless you're, you know, an elite athlete in competing in a specific sport, okay? So let's just, we're almost done here, but, and I've talked about this already. We've talked about HIIT versus steady state cardio. But again, depending on what type of training you want to do, we know HIIT is more anaerobic. HIIT will actually be kind of more beneficial in, let's say, preserving muscle mass if you're doing it in combination with resistance training. And we know that this is working at like high capacity, not much rest, looking at, you know, like intervals, right? As we've talked about. So if you were doing resistance training and you wanted to maintain muscle mass and still improve your aerobic capacity a bit, you can incorporate some HIIT training. If you wanted to do steady state, you can do either one. It's kind of more personal preference. You can do a combination of both, but with steady state, again, we're looking more aerobic, 60 to 70% of our maximal capacity for 20 minutes or more, right? And that's going to help improve your cardiovascular endurance, right? As we've talked about, as those adaptations will happen. So again, I have more videos for you. It looks like our timing is not going to happen, but please watch them. They're really informative videos. So there's one on HIIT versus steady state cardio, and then if cardio can hurt your gains. So feel free to watch those. They're really interesting videos. We're almost done. Okay, so last couple slides here. I'll just finish off because we took like 13 minutes at the beginning to talk. So that's why it's 2 o'clock already. Almost there. Okay. So just comparing again, endurance versus aerobic, endurance versus resistance training. For someone who is untrained, again, we're going to just have a muscle fiber look like this, right? So this is a muscle fiber. The yellow parts here, that's your mitochondria. So what happens with endurance training? We're going to get more mitochondria, as we can see. Okay, the muscle kind of gets more dense and actually a little bit smaller. Whereas with resistance training, we don't see any changes in mitochondria, and the muscle fiber gets larger. That's hypertrophy, right? And we have more actin myosin, right? That's like the summary of what happens with resistance training. And then endurance training in the muscle, we're going to have more mitochondria, more capillaries surrounding that muscle so we can get better oxygen delivery. We have more enzymes to help with ATP production, more myoglobin, which is going to help with oxygen delivery to the mitochondria inside the muscle. And as we know, if I did resistance training in combination with endurance training, the resistance training will not help to improve my VO2 max, okay? So that's kind of like your summary of the two different adaptations between aerobic and resistance training. So so here's the aspect, right? If my goal was to get maximally stronger, will aerobic training affect that, okay? And so if your goal is maximal strength, you should not be doing long, steady state aerobic workouts. There's no need to go run 5K, 10K, 30 minutes, 60 minutes. You don't need to do that. Again, as I mentioned, HIIT has little to no impact on your strength gain. So if your goal was maximal strength and lift more weight, then you might as well incorporate HIIT training as part of your cardio, and that's your cardio. And so that's your goal. But if your goal is to improve your aerobic endurance, you're not going to see resistance training affect you. And this is like moderate weights. So we're not doing maximal loads. Again, the maximal loads might fatigue you if you were then going to go into an aerobic session, but it will not decrease your aerobic fitness. Okay. So overall, for most people, doing both is going to be the best, aerobic and resistance training, to do a combination of both so we can get both of these adaptations happening, right? We want to get higher stroke volume. We want to lower resting heart rate. But we also don't want to lose muscle as we age, right? So for most people, unless again you're serious into a sport or a specific activity that you want to improve at, then you can focus on those goals. But for most people, for just general overall health, aerobic and resistance training is going to be your best bet to do both. Okay, so that concludes what we're talking about today, and I really hope you watch the videos because they're really, really helpful and informative. But next week is the last week of new content, okay, where we talk about exercise psychology for the personal trainer. So more about like motivation, and then some benefits of exercise and what exercise is good for their mental health and all that fun stuff. So that'll be the last lecture. It's not heavy with content. And then the week after, we will do a review for your final test. And your final test will be the week of December the 13th. It'll be just the same format as test 1, where it'll be open all week and you can write it whenever you want. And it'll be due by that Friday, which is the 17th. So that is the end for me. And I know you have another class. Enjoy your weekend. Please watch the videos. They're very informative and interesting. And they're all posted for you under the lecture content under this week. Okay. If you have any questions, you can quickly ask or send me an email, or we can talk in lab. But I know you have another class, and it's running late now.
I have some 2 questions just about the assignment.
Yeah, sure.
Cool. For the pictures, for the stretches and stuff, do we need to reference those?
No, you don't. I'm not going to make you reference them.
Okay, cool. And then what's the difference between the prescribed 1RM and the predicted 1RM? Did you go over that in the video, or?
So I believe that would be for the case study. If you were to do a predicted 1RM, you could get it from the numbers that were given.
Yeah.
And then you would prescribe it in like the program, what percent of 1RM you want. But if it's for yourself,
Yeah.
I would, what you can do. So I would just put a weight rather than a percent 1RM or anything like that. Because you know what weights you can probably do already. Unless you want to.
I did do the calculation. I like put whatever weight I normally do, and then did the calculation for the predicted 1RM. So
okay.
Is it okay if I just leave it like that, or?
Yeah, you can, if you filled in those charts, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then during your program, if you want, I would write the weight and then in brackets what percent 1RM that is, if you want to do that. Okay. But I don't expect you to have to do that. It's kind of what you prefer to put, but I wouldn't just put 60% 1RM. Like if you know what weights you can do. So because it's a program for you, then I expect to see like a weight as well.
Mm-hmm, for sure. And like, so it's just those 3, or well, I filled most of them out for the 3 charts, even though I'm doing my own, just because I knew some of the information. But it's just basically the cardio chart, the like breakdown of what the week looks like, and then the resistance training charts, and that's it. I'm not missing anything, am I?
No, and then again, you would need to submit that Get Active questionnaire and the questions, right? That would be submitted if you're doing that program for yourself. And then 1 resistance training program per day that you've prescribed. So if you have 4 days that you've prescribed, you'll need 1 chart each day, right?
Yeah, no, makes sense. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Jenna.
Awesome. No problem.
Have a good weekend.
You too. Enjoy your weekend.